Hello, everyone, and welcome to our tonight's event at TNR Live, which is focusing on Can We Protect the Ballot? Discussion on voting rights and on the future of American democracy and what those two forces entail for one another. I'm very pleased tonight to be joined by four panelists who are happy to lend their expertise and their insight on one of the most critical questions facing this country right now. With us tonight is Tiffany Muller. She's the president of In Citizens United. Allison Riggs, she's the co-executive director for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Inse Ufot, she's the CEO of the New Georgia Project. And Michael Waldman, the president of the Brennan Center for Justice. Before we get started, I'd also like to ask everyone that if you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function that is part of Zoom, and we will hopefully get to those later in the program. But for now, I want to start with Tiffany, and I want to start with sort of a broad-based discussion of where we stand right now. Democrats on Capitol Hill, they have just gone through a year-long process to pass major voting rights legislation. We saw the Freedom to Vote Act. We saw the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We've seen a lot of bills, and they haven't come to anything, and that's drawn a lot of attention on the federal side of things. What's really happening on the state and local level right now? What's really happening on the sort of ground front of democracy?
Well, first, thank you so much, Matt, for having me on tonight. And it's such a privilege and an honor to be on with my esteemed colleagues on the panel as well. I always love any opportunity to get a chance to share the stage with them. We were heavily involved in the fight to pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And, we got all the way up to the 1 yard line and moved the Senate caucus so far on the idea of changing the rules in order to protect our democracy. And look, it is a matter of time before we pass that bill. It might not happen this Congress, but it is going to happen. But because we know that that is likely not going to happen during this Congress, we have turned and started putting a lot of our attention in 2022 on state and local elections. I mean, this election cycle, we are seeing a real disturbing pattern where local officials are facing death threats for simply doing their job and upholding the will of the people. We've seen these trusted local election officials who just want to do their job face hundreds of threats of death and at least 800 intimidating messages in 12 states alone. There have also been laws like in Georgia, SB 202, that allows partisan state officials to remove local election officials and replace them with self-serving partisan politicians. This is really, really dangerous. And I know we're going to talk about this a lot throughout the night, but it is one of the things that really keeps me up at night worrying about our democracy. And we've seen county governments that perpetuate the big lie, and the folks who are running across the country who are leaning into denying the results of the 2020 election and continuing to perpetuate both conspiracy theories and the big lie. So what we are doing is we're really looking at how do we create a fire line for our democracy. And in 2022, we have started a new program, the Democracy Defenders Program, to really focus on re-electing secretaries of state and attorneys generals across the country who are going to go about both executing the elections in a free, fair, and nonpartisan manner, and making sure that we have attorneys generals in those same states that are going to go uphold those election results in the courts if they come under attack, as we're all afraid that they might in 2024. So we are dedicating at least $7 million to helping elect those champions, because we know that those constitutional officers are at the forefront of protecting our democracy. And last thing, we also launched a democracy caucus to bring together state and local elected officials from across the country who care about our democracy, to get them connected with each other, to give them resources and to help them learn from each other, because we are seeing these attacks on our democracy all across the country. And if you're a state legislature and in Georgia or in Texas or in Arizona facing these threats, you should all be able to learn from each other. So that is what we're focused on. And there's no doubt about it that much of this fight is taking place at the state and local level.
And I know that when you mentioned Georgia's Senate Bill 202, and it really seems like Georgia is a state that is sort of at the intersection between voter suppression, the big lie, these toxic changes in our politics that have happened not only over the last few years, but have been building up preceding that. I want to bring in an Insay here to sort of discuss more about the Georgia situation in particular. I know that last night they had a series of primary elections there that sort of saw some mixed results for where things can go next. Insay, can you give us a sense of how things look in Georgia now, 1 year after SB 202, and what the future might hold?
2 years of this, y'all, 2 years. Well, one, good evening. And really happy to be here with you all. I think there are a couple of things that it's important to note as we think about Georgia, and Georgia as an example of what we will be seeing in the country. There's a massive, rapid demographic shift that is happening in our state. Political scientists and demographers are referring to it as the reversal of the Great Migration, right? So the Great Migration between the 1920s and the 1970s, Black Americans fled the South, right? Fleeing racial violence, but also seeking economic opportunities, right? Why tons of African Americans in Chicago can trace their roots to Mississippi, tons of African Americans in New York and New Jersey trace their roots to the Carolinas and to Georgia. And now folks are returning to the South, or their children are returning to the South. And it is creating these opportunities that it's creating a sort of a different electorate, a more diverse electorate. While a lot has been written about the country that's going to become majority people of color by 2050, that date is like 2025, 2026 in Georgia, where white folks will no longer be the majority. And so when you think about the folks who are in power, right, that they're the Republicans, currently have a governing trifecta in our state. At the same time, my organization, the New Georgia Project, has helped over 600,000 young people and people of color to vote in all 159 of Georgia's counties. And so there really is a shift that is happening in the political identity of Georgia as a state and across the South. And while there are some of us who are super excited about the new Georgia and the new America and building this multiracial democracy that has been written about, there are some people who are terrified by it, and they're doing everything that they can. They stink of desperation, and it looks like Senate Bill 202 with over 50 different changes to Georgia's voting laws, where Senate Bill 202 has created 5 new voting crimes. 2 of them are felonies, and they carry with them a penalty of up to 10 years in prison and $100,000 in fines. They're criminalizing things like handing out water and portable cell phone chargers. It rained yesterday in Georgia, and we had ponchos available for voters who wanted to come and take them because we couldn't actually give them to voters while they were standing in line, right? And so as we think about folks who are coming to recognize the power of their vote, particularly young folks and people of color in Georgia, right? Much has been written and much has been said about the historic nature of the 2020 elections. What was done 9 weeks later on January 5th, when we elected Warnock and Ossoff, and then what happened the next day on January 6th. These feel like an example of the sort of progress that we are making towards realizing the multiracial democracy, and then the corresponding backlash, or let me be just honest, white lash, that we see that corresponds with this progress that we are collectively making as a country. And so what is happening in Georgia is not unique. And neither there is the fight back and neither is the pushback. 400 anti-voting bills were introduced, 400 in 49 out of our 50 states. And Georgia was just one of the first to pass because of our 40-day legislative session. So something that we should be concerned of, but there are also lessons from Georgia about how we fight back as a collective to preserve our democracy, or the ideal of American democracy.
You know, one of the things that really stood out to me last year when the timeline was going on about the passage of these voting rights bills in Congress and sort of the moments that energized and sort of re-energized the fight. I know that Georgia's experience was one that really, for a time, seemed to get Democrats back in the game. Now that they've fallen away, Michael, I'm curious, what is your sense of what the impact will be on the midterms overall without sort of renewed voting protections after the lessons of 2020?
Well, as we all know, this midterm election and the 2024 election will revolve around the issues of the state of our democracy and the health of our democracy in ways that we have not seen in years and years. There have been other times in our country's history where who votes, who has the ability to participate in our democratic system, where those have been the big issues. And certainly that is true today. And it's wonderful to be on this panel with my colleagues. One of the things that is so encouraging about this moment is the extremely impressive and passionate and skilled, explicitly political organizing that is going on around these voting issues, both nationally and in states like Georgia. That is one of the developments that gives hope for this in the long run. We know that there is an assault on the right to vote. There is an assault on our democratic institutions, that we have, for the first time, certainly in a long time, one of the national political parties devoted to the lie that our election was stolen, the lie that it is riddled with fraud. And, you know, there have been times in the past and in recent past where Republican politicians, for example, when they take control of a state legislature, they pass bad laws to restrict the vote, but they've done it not as a hobby, but because they could. Now this is a mobilizing and organizing and a unifying issue for millions of voters who believe Trump's big lie. And that is a new and scary thing. What is significant is there are ways to push back. Now, I don't want to minimize how important it was to push for that national voting legislation. A lot of very cynical people said, oh, it was never going to pass. We came, as Tiffany said, very close. And there just are times when states are abusing the rights of their people, when federal legislation, federal action is the only real strong alternative. And as we know, if Congress cannot pass and protect voting rights because of the filibuster, even when there's a majority, and the courts will not, the federal courts will not protect voting rights because they're reactionary, then that gives a green light to a lot of state governments to abuse the rights of their people. It doesn't leave us without tools. We at the Brennan Center and others as well are especially focused this year on using state courts and state constitutions as a way to protect voting rights. People don't realize this, but every state but one has explicit protection for the right to vote in their constitution, stronger than the US Constitution has. Now, in the past, a lot of state courts have just sort of said, well, we're going to just do whatever the federal courts say this means in how they've interpreted the US Constitution. But this year, on voting cases and on redistricting cases, we've actually seen state courts, including Democrats and Republicans, step up and say they're going to protect representation, protect the right to vote. There's a fierce fight over that, as we're going to, I'm sure, talk about. Another thing we all need to do is to act to defend these election officials who are the front lines right now, who are facing threats of violence. Many of them are leaving their jobs. They didn't sign up to be election officials for the glamour or the big bucks. We depend on them. And this is something that the voting rights movement and law enforcement and businesses and others need to step up for them, just like people did in 2020 during the pandemic. We should never forget that in 2020, as hard as that was, despite the pandemic and despite the voter suppression and despite the lies, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. And as the Department of Homeland Security said, under Trump, it was the most secure election ever. There was a real democracy movement across the society that mobilized to save that election. That democracy movement continued in the fight for the Freedom to Vote Act, John Lewis Act, and that democracy movement, I hope, will be the counter to the big lie and the counter to the attack on our democracy that we're seeing.
I'm glad you mentioned state courts and their role in protecting voting rights, because I think one of the most visible fronts in this fight, especially over the past 6 months or so, has been redistricting. We just went through the once in every 10 years process of counting every American and tabulating them all in the census. We reapportioned the House districts. And now we're really figuring out what the geography of political power is going to be for the next decade. And Allison, I know that you have a lot of experience with this. What do you think the state of play is right now with this? Where do you think, we know that in 2010, Republicans had extraordinary success tilting their maps in favor for most of the 2010s. How did the two sides fare this time?
It's been a mixed bag. Largely, we've been, as voting rights advocates, been frustrated by sort of opaque federal rulings under what's called a so-called Purcell principle, that we don't want to change election laws or voting districts too close to an election. We get these rulings without any explanation or opinion, and so we're really flying blind when it comes to understanding how to litigate faster than we are. We're doing it as fast as we can. I will say that in terms of going to state court for relief, we had states like North Carolina and Wisconsin where the state courts did provide relief for egregiously gerrymandered maps. And in North Carolina, we survived review from the US Supreme Court. Wisconsin did not. And so it's a real mixed bag in terms of whether the state courts are up to the task of enforcing voting rights. And to Michael's point, it's important for folks to understand that the federal Constitution provides the floor of basic protections, and state constitutions provide the ceiling. So there can be this huge difference. But if you look at a state like Texas, where 55% of the population identify as non-Hispanic, as non-white voters, it's a majority minority state. The Texas Supreme Court is radically out of sync with the population and what they need and what fairly serves them. So when I argued the Rucho case, one of the main arguments was, you're inviting a patchwork system of justice by relying solely on state courts to enforce basic principles of fairness when it comes to representation. And we're seeing that prediction play out. I will also say, I don't want to take up too much time, but any discussion about the efficacy of state courts to defend fundamental rights and ensure fair representation, particularly for historically excluded communities, we can't discuss this without discussing judicial ethics. These state court systems are ones in which they are highly politicized. I know it sounds crazy to say it's worse than the US Supreme Court. Highly politicized. The people who are overseeing judicial ethics are political appointees who are, punitive toward any justice that might be siding with justice and free access to the ballot box and a representative democracy. So these challenges, I know I'm preaching to the choir about why we need federal legislation and it needs to be multifaceted, but our wins, as few and far between as our state court wins are, they're not going to hold with the state judiciaries being as rankly partisan as they are. And so I think this is, there's a lot of litigation left in in this redistricting cycle. No one is giving up. No one is giving up. We will fight. Last cycle, I was arguing in the Supreme Court in 2019. So we will fight till the very end. But the deck is stacked against us, and we do have the power to change that. We have the power to elect a Congress that understands what damage is being done. And we're working as we litigate to make sure that voters aren't discouraged by setbacks and understand the power of their vote.
And Allison, you mentioned really quickly the Purcell principle. And I know this is something I come across in my work covering the courts, and it's something that it doesn't come up very often except right before elections. Can you discuss a little more what that is and what that'll mean? Because I have a feeling it's going to be sort of surfacing for a lot of people in the next few months.
So it started, I want to say in 2006, don't quote me on that, but it's this idea, it comes up in these what are called emergency stay applications. So they're these rushed, it's not a full briefing schedule, there's no argument. This issue comes up in this truncated procedural posture. And usually it's states saying, it's too close to the election to change any election rules, that it would be burdensome on state election officials and confusing to voters. And as civil rights litigants, and so over the years, for certainly in the 2010s, the use of that principle got expanded, but the principal use of it was to stop changes that would expand or protect voting rights access. So in terms of voter ID laws, or if a state had cut early voting, using the Purcell principle to say, oh, it's too late to restore early voting to the 17-day period it's been for 20 years. The legislature cut it to 10 days just a couple of months ago, and voters will be confused. Voters won't be confused, but a couple of things on that. One is, I'll go back to sort of judicial ethics and transparency. It's a deeply problematic application of the law by the courts because it doesn't give the litigants and the parties a fair understanding of where's the line, what are the factors that matter. Some of these are issued with, per curiam. We don't know who's on what side. The logic tend to be very short. And the other thing is there's no understanding by the Supreme Court of the qualitative difference between Purcell as it applies to restricting voting versus Purcell as applied to expanding voting. So for example, just to give them the argument that there might be some voter confusion, if you made it easier to register to vote, a voter who doesn't know about that and might be confused about that, they're still going to benefit from making it easier to register to vote. Whereas if the opposite is true, if you make it harder to register to vote, a voter who doesn't know about that is much more likely to miss out on an opportunity to participate. And so part of judicial ethics reform and judicial practice reform needs to be a sense of accountability. Our courts work for us as citizens and voters, and they need to explain themselves. There needs to be a clear rule of law, and this needs to change.
Speaking of the Supreme Court, Jim, one of the audience members who's used our Q&A function to ask questions of the panelists, he asked that the Supreme Court recently voted to further increase the use of dark money in Congress. Is this not just another and maybe even more of a threat to the power of the ballot? And I believe he's referring to the court's decision earlier this month in FEC v. Ted Cruz for Senate. It was a decision on loan repayments to campaigns. Tiffany, it seems like from this decision that the Roberts Court still seems pretty hostile to campaign finance reform. How does that affect how advocates think about future efforts to sort of fix the system?
Yeah, that seems like an understatement for how this court approaches campaign finance. cases before it. I think if there is one thing that we know that this court is going to be known for, it is for really undermining the foundations of our democracy, everything from voting rights to redistricting to, of course, money in politics. And with FEC versus Cruz, yet again, you have this court increasing the opportunity and likelihood for corruption, right? And for those who are watching who don't know, this decision allows politicians to basically loan their campaigns unlimited amounts of money, and then allows them to take whatever amounts of money that wealthy donors want to give them to reimburse them personally, right? So the donors are effectively repaying the loan to the candidate. And yet somehow that is supposed to not increase corruption in our system, right? I think we all know that the way this works is that absolutely is going to increase corruption in our system. And Jim, you are right. I mean, the money that is flooded into our system since, look, our name is End Citizens United. We believe it is one of the most problematic decisions that this court has had, because it took two really terrible ideas, it merged them together, saying money equals speech and corporations are people. And it allowed this unlimited and undisclosed flood of money into our election system. And what we see right now is a democracy that is not representative, that is not responsive to the people, that is not actually pushing forward the priorities of the people. Rather, it's pushing forward the priorities of the biggest donors, right? I mean, today we are all talking about Texas and the tragedy there, right? 90% of people want a universal background gun checks. And why can't we get it done? It is the money that the NRA has been funding politicians. Why can't we actually get a bill passed to cap insulin cost? Because of the power of Big Pharma's checkbook, right? And we can go on and on. But guess what else? The money that has packed the Supreme Court is all that same unlimited dark money. $600 million spent to pack the Supreme Court with conservatives that then turn around and make decisions like what we're talking about here tonight about undermining our very democracy. $600 million, or $42 million by Heritage Foundation to push state voter suppression laws across the country last year in 2021. How do we know they were doing it? They were caught on video bragging about it and about how easy it was to pass it in state after state. So this dark money is fundamentally tied into whether or not we are actually going to allow the people to have power in our democracy, or only the wealthiest few and the special interest. And so, Jim, I agree with you. We know that right now the money that's flooding into our system is a big part of what's undermining our democracy. And just like we have to protect our freedom to vote, we also have to fight to get the big money out of politics.
You know, it's funny, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on this stuff is something to the effect of, you know, you can spend, you know, rich or poor, whether you're a millionaire or not, as an American, you can spend how much money you'd like in an election, which is certainly not comforting for those of us on the smaller end of that spectrum. But at the same time, you know, as much as we talk about sort of the dire forecast for voting rights, we have seen some signs for optimism. And I know that when I speak to voting rights activists around the country, one thing that they continually bring up to me is the new Georgia project and the success it's had in making Georgia a state that more accurately reflects and represents many of its citizens' interests. And say, I'm hoping you can tell us a bit more about what your organization does that makes it so special. What's the secret sauce behind its success there?
Okay, so I'll tell you what we do, and then I'll tell you what I think the secret sauce is. So, I mean, the way that the way I've structured the organization and the way that we do our work, I think about it in terms of buckets, right? So there's organizing, boots on the ground. We are connecting the issues that Georgians tell us they care about with the power of the vote, routinely and as a matter of course, and how we talk about how we win on those issues. Because the truth is that people will tell you what their hopes are and their dreams and their ambitions for themselves, for their families, for their communities. They'll also tell you what their fears are and the things that keep them up at night. And you know, we work routinely to connect that to the power of the vote. I think the way that we train our organizers and our volunteers is that they have twice as many ears as they do mouths. And so it's our responsibility to be listening. And so what that means to us is there's really no daylight between the communities that we organize with and the New Georgia Project. Like, we understand what the priorities are in Willacoochee, Georgia, and in Decatur, Georgia, in Southwest Atlanta, and in Athens, Georgia, right? And like, what is going to move people to action? And that's a regular part of what we do. At the core of everything that we do is a very bold, very aggressive research agenda. You know, I will be forgiven. I'm raised in the South and I'm a church girl. And the Bible says that you study to show yourself approved. And we believe that just because we have these identities, it doesn't automatically make us experts in the politics of the communities that we're organizing in. So just because I'm a Black woman does not make me an expert in gender politics. It doesn't make me an expert in Black politics. And so we're constantly asking these questions. And so we built up, you know, the infrastructure to do our own polling, to do focus groups, to do surveys as a regular part of the work that we do. Michael and Allison, we've had the opportunity to work with both of your organizations. Not you yet, Tiffany, but I'm certain the time will come. Actually, no, we have done some cool stuff within Citizens United as well. What am I saying? That litigation is a part of the work that we do. The truth of the matter is that the legal environment in Georgia for voting and elections is trash, and intentionally so, that they have taken a sledgehammer to our elections infrastructure. I mean, and I know I have several opinions about why that is, but you know, being a part of impact litigation is an important part of how we are fighting back as the New Georgia Project on behalf of the communities that we organize with. I would say comms, like how we talk about democracy, how we talk about power, how we talk about what is happening in this moment, right? It is not passive at all. And again, it's a super important part of how we do what we do. And then I think lastly, it's technology and it's culture, and it's and I think that that's a part of our secret sauce as well. We just released our first video game at South by Southwest this year, right? Okay, so we've registered over 600,000 people to vote in all 159 of Georgia's counties. We have about 400,000 people's cell phone numbers with permission to keep texting them. So we ask people, do you want to download this video game? Candy Crush is the most popular video game in all of the app stores. And so why not build our own Candy Crush with Georgia iconography, right? Peaches and peanuts and Georgia Bulldogs and the varsity. For those of you who know, if you know, you know, like, you know, delicious cheese dogs, basically, hot dogs, chili dogs. But it is a part of the culture. We want to change the culture of electoral participation. We want to change the culture of democracy. That's important. So we work with culture workers. Sometimes you get, you know, comedy skits, you get memes, you get bad rap parodies, you get TikTok dances, right? Like, as a way to keep this conversation going and to keep the conversation around democracy in Georgia alive. Again, not for its own sake, like not as democracy as a virtue, as a thing in and of itself that we should work for, but as a very practical way to win the things that they told us that they care about, and to change the things that they told us that they no longer can stand to see continue. And that is why, even though the president's approval ratings are, quite frankly, in the toilet, and the opposition party, the Republicans party's approval ratings are in hell, that we still are having overwhelming participation in our elections, because there's a maturation, there's a sophistication that we've been organizing for in Georgia, because it's connected to the things that people want for themselves, and we will not shut up about it. And the truth of the matter is that nothing focuses the mind like the credible threat of death, right? So we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? The Brian Kemp and the Republicans in Georgia continue to refuse to expand Medicaid, right? 12 hospitals in rural Georgia have closed or are about to close. People are still having babies, people are still fighting cancer, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? That gun violence at a moment where it is at its height, and people are terrified to send their babies to school. Governor Kemp, in his wisdom, and the Republicans in Georgia saw fit to get rid of permits, so that we now are permitless permitless carry state that is a month old, right, in our state. And so again, I think that we look like the new Georgia. The oldest person on our staff was born in the 30s. The youngest person on our staff will be voting for the first time this year and was born in 2004. So we pause. We recognize that people in 2004 are voting this year, right? And again, our diversity in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of geography and class and income sort of represent the new Georgia. And it is in fact our strength. You cannot dismiss us as like a Black org. You can't dismiss us as a youth org, that we truly represent the Georgia that we want to live in.
You know, part of that is going to be, I'm actually going to look up that video game you mentioned. I ran through all of mine during quarantine and lockdown and everything. So
it's called This Is Not a Game.
Oh, it's a good name for it.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. You know, Michael, when we talk about sort of the space that activists can use on the ground and the energy that they pour into it, I know that we saw in the Freedom to Vote Act and the related legislation that Congress has considered over the past year or so, we saw really an almost unprecedented amount of energy towards getting those bills. And like the panel has mentioned, it got to the 1 yard line. What sort of lessons have been drawn by advocates for that bill, should they get another chance in the near future to sort of put it up for a vote?
Well, it's a great question, and I will answer the last part first, which is there will be another chance. These fights continue and must continue, and among other things, just remember that voting rights failed in Congress in 1957 and 1960, and in 1964, taken out of the Civil Rights Act before the triumph in 1965, and I hope it doesn't take that long. But these fights are hard fought for a reason, because the stakes are so high. And just as some people are pressing to make real the ideals of our democracy, other people are always fighting to keep what they have, backlash, white backlash, and others. There were a few things to me, and I'm embarrassed to admit I've worked on these issues of democracy reform for 4 decades now. I'm near that end of the staff at New Georgia Project than those born in 2004. There were a few things that were really quite striking. First was the power that came from the breadth of the legislation. This was, when you add it all up, legislation that dealt with voting rights, that set national standards for voting, that banned gerrymandering, and that addressed dark money and began a public financing system of small donor matching funds for federal races. And people always wondered, well, if you have all these different aspects of democracy in one bill, is that going to be a good idea or a bad idea? Well, it turned out, I would say, to bring strength and power to this bill, because it addressed the many interlocking problems that our democracy faces. And it actually broadened the coalition. In years past, on far too many issues, there have been divisions between good government groups, civil rights groups, labor and progressive groups. This actually united them, and we had everybody pulling in the same direction. So one thing I think is the power in not going into little slivers of policy goals, but really asking what would it take in the broadest sense to save our democracy. The second thing I would say is something that I think the folks on this panel represent in various ways, which was this was an explicitly political push. This was a coalition that was diverse and broad and passionate. And in the end, it would have been wonderful if it had been a bipartisan bill. But it was really important that this strong legislation be moving at all. And so the fact that you had the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, fiercely fighting for this legislation, that you had Senator Schumer and the Democratic leadership in the Senate stepping in and making it not just HR1 in the House, but S1 in the Senate, sent a very strong signal that for the first time in a long time, they were making these issues of democracy and voting rights central to their political agenda. The White House, frankly, was a little iffy for far too much of the time. And I think that was an unfortunate fact. But part of what we need to do is to make sure that we love both parties to be standing up for democracy, but it's important that at least one of them do it. And the final thing that I think is really what Insee was describing and what we all see and admire from outside of Georgia, which is this isn't something that goes away after the election, after votes are cast, whether it's on the floor of Congress or in the voting booth. There needs to be a long-term infrastructure of support for our democracy, just as there is a long-term infrastructure of people now trying to undermine our democracy. This is not something for just a few days before the election or a few 30-second ads, but for the long haul. These are all things that I think, again, give me considerable hope and optimism based on what was built in this fight, if we can keep it going.
I believe I saw a raised hand sign, but I don't think I caught the name. Did somebody raise their hand and want to add more? No? Okay. I will check the gas in my apartment later then. One of the things that, we talk about second chances coming up, maybe this Congress will still be Democratic. I mean, we don't know what seemingly week to week what the midterms will be thought about anymore. But it's hard to know what the future will hold for that. But one thing that is more predictable with redistricting in particular, as you mentioned, is that it will not come up again for a little while. There's going to be sort of a period of fighting and digesting what's happened. Allison, what can you really tell us about where this goes next on redistricting now that the census is done? Now that the courts have started to weigh in, where are the fights going to go from here?
So what I think we're seeing nationally is an attention to competitive districts and what voters can do in competitive districts. And I think that's important. And I do want to do everything we can to encourage turnout in those districts. We have a couple of them in North Carolina after not having any for a decade. But what I want to also sort of emphasize in terms of redistricting is the pushing back this narrative and the way we communicate with our partners, our constituents, our friends. What Insee talked about, comms is critically important. And building this infrastructure that's non-transactional, not just about getting people to go out and register and to vote, but to understand what their needs are, how government is serving them or is not serving them. The reality is that particularly in the South, the demographics are changing. And we believe deeply in a new Southern strategy, one that reclaims that language for a positive purpose. And if we in the South, I'm in North Carolina, if we in the South can achieve wins and build political power in the face of egregious voter suppression and gerrymandering, then anyone can do it. And so I think part of what we need to communicate while the legal battles are ongoing, while the jurisprudence is developing, is that yes, gerrymandering is a form of voter suppression. And I'm sure I was one of the people whose head exploded when we heard you can out-organize gerrymandering. That's pretty dismissive of what voters on the ground are feeling. That being said, our numbers are changing, and we're not going to out-organize gerrymandering, but we're going to change our culture, change our demands of government, and coalesce as a political movement to demand reform and redistricting, to demand parity and equity and equality. And I think that movement, as opposed to any particular district lines, is what I hope that we continue to talk about, continue to learn from New Georgia Project and other amazing groups from Louisiana to Texas, all over the South. And we'll win some legal battles in in the meantime. So I have no doubt I'm a hopeless optimist. We'll keep fighting from every angle. And so I do think you'll see some redistricting wins and some redistricting losses, but we learn from the losses too. We learn what we need to do in terms of comms and organizing and strategy. And the South is resilient, and we won't be held back, and the nation will follow.
One of the things, and Michael mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that struck me so much about the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis bill, the voting rights legislation in general, was that voting rights was interpreted very broadly. It was covering things like redistricting. It was also covering things like campaign finance reform. Tiffany, I know that historically speaking, campaign finance was not traditionally treated as part of the voting rights fight. We know that the last major legislation on it was in 2002, McCain-Feingold. I believe that's the case. It was the last major one, but it wasn't really seen. It was seen as sort of an anti-corruption measure. Do you think that fusion is going to be a permanent feature going forward of campaign finance fights?
Well, like Michael said, I really hope it is, Matt, and I'll tell you why. This is about who gets to have power and who gets to have voice in our democracy. And so voting rights and redistricting and money in politics are all interconnected in that fight for who is our government going to represent. And so what we saw is that the issues around campaign finance, around money in politics, around anti-corruption, were actually integral in getting support and building the coalition around this bill, and to make sure we had the momentum in Congress that we needed to push it forward. And part of that is because voters care about it. We've all been talking a little bit about how we built momentum for these efforts, and INSEE talked about it well. It's because it's about what voters care about. And they care about whether or not they can access the ballot box. And it turns out they also care about whether or not their voice is being drowned out by hundreds of millions of dollars that are raining in from big billionaires or corporate special interests. Because at the end of the day, what we hear a lot in the focus groups we do across the country is, look, I am working harder and harder, but I am getting left further and further behind. And it just feels like nobody cares. It feels like nobody is listening to what's going on in our life, and nobody is fighting for us and helping us. And when they say nobody, what they mean is that Washington feels very disconnected from the problems that they're facing in their day-to-day life. And that's about what happens here in Washington. It's about the amount of money that permeates Capitol Hill. It's about who gets in those lunches and who sets the agenda, and how lobbyists get to have access that regular voters don't. So this is about who gets to have power in our democracy. And Michael's absolutely right. Tying all of these issues together broadened our coalition. It broadened the way that we talked about and the way we messaged on what is a responsive representative democracy. And that's something that we can't just let go, right? We have to, as INSEE said, we have to continue talking about that. We have to continue meeting voters where they're at. And I will also say, we faced a lot of skepticism that voters cared about these issues at all, that they could help candidates win elections, that voters don't care about that process stuff like money in politics. Let me tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. We saw it in 2018 when it helped flip the House. We saw it in 2020 when it helped flip the Senate. And guess what else? We saw it when it created the largest movement that we've seen to try to help pass these major pieces of legislation and got us to that 1 yard line. And someone asked in the chat, and since I'm talking, I'm going to take a second to answer it. Who is standing in the way? What's standing in the way of us getting this all the way over the finish line? Look, we have 48 votes in the Senate to change the filibuster rules and pass this bill tomorrow. We need 2 more votes in the Senate. That's what we need. We have a Manchin problem and we have a Sinema problem. So we got to go win Wisconsin. We got to go win Pennsylvania. We got to go win North Carolina. And we got to reelect folks in Georgia, in Arizona, in New Hampshire, in Nevada, so that we have the extra 2 votes that we need to actually make this change and get this bill passed.
I'm really glad you mentioned. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I want to actually suggest that not only do I agree with what Tiffany said, but that this is actually a not only connecting with voters and how they see the issues of democracy, but actually connecting with how it has been thought about throughout most of American history. These issues of voting rights and representation and the role of wealth and money have actually been the same issue for much of the country's history. The very first voting rights advance, if you want to call it that, was ending the property requirement for voting for white men so that poor and working class white men could vote. In the turn of the 20th century, at a time very much like ours right now, of massive inequality, of concentration of capital, political corruption, the answer in part was the Tillman Act and passing legislation to ban corporate spending, and the 17th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to people and not just state legislatures for senators. They thought that was campaign finance reform because legislatures were so corrupt. And the fight for the 19th Amendment, which was the fight to give women the guaranteed right to vote, which was not, for many women, was not real until the Voting Rights Act, but which nevertheless doubled the size of the electorate with one constitutional amendment. They saw during other times in our history, these issues were intertwined. Just like in 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act, and a few years later, you had public financing of presidential campaigns. People saw this as one fight.
I'm also glad that Tiffany mentioned sort of the despair aspect of this, because that's something I run into a lot when I talk to people about this issue, when I talk to people for stories, when I cover it myself, the sense of hopelessness about how to fix all these problems. Insee, I know that you have a lot more contact with voters on the ground about this sort of thing. When somebody tells you, you know, they don't think their vote matters, they don't think it's worth the effort, that the system doesn't really work for them, how do you counter, how do you challenge that messaging?
I mean, I start by asking, what does matter? Like, what do they care about? What will they fight for? Right? Like, what? Okay, it's all burning. It's all going to hell. What will you save? What will you pull out of the house? We start there, right? And then we work backwards, right? So think about the summer of 2020. The country's on fire. The streets are on fire. Folks are protesting. They've murdered George Floyd, police officers. Vigilantes murdered Ahmaud Arbery, and corrupt prosecutors covered it up down in Brunswick, Georgia, on and on and on. And so we're out with young people, we're out with folks, and they're upset and enraged. And, you know, you have these like clever signs about, you know, stop killing us, et cetera. And then we say, you know, you obviously care about reform and policing. Are you registered to vote? No. Why not? Voting doesn't matter. They're killing us. That's the priority. That's why we're here. And so, you know, we say things like, you know, when there is a jury trial to try these officers who murdered this man, they pull the list of jurors from the list of registered voters. And so while it might not be likely that you make it on the roll, we know you'll never make it on the jury pool if you're not registered to vote, right? And so, like, again, that's an example. You know, people talk about the cost of living, right? I've talked about the reversal of the Great Migration and how many people are moving to Atlanta. And while we're happy for the changes that it's made to our electorate and change, you know, Georgia into America's newest battleground state, it also has driven up the cost of housing, and houselessness and the cost of housing is a huge problem, right? So, you know, I'm talking to a young worker, you know who does vote? Your landlord, right? You know who does vote? Your boss, right? So, I mean, again, it starts with, you know, what is it that you actually care about? And I will say that it is in the fight. I think one of the frustrations that, you know, when young people communicate to us that they're frustrated with their leaders, it's not necessarily that they haven't won on the issues, although there's definitely some impatience with the pace of progress. It's also that they see people as not fighting, or as one person put it, you ever seen someone running towards the elevator and you don't want to you don't want to hold the elevator open. So you're pressing the metal plate and not the button to hold the elevator open. That there's a sense that there are a lot of elected officials who rhetorically are aligned with democracy and aligned with the people, but they're really just pressing the metal plate and performing, as opposed to getting down and fighting for the things that we actually care about. And I think that keeps us in the fight, because again, there are things that we actually want to win, one. And I think two, they say that you cannot fix what you haven't faced. And one of the things that I noted when Tiffany and both Michael were talking about Senators Manchin and Sinema is that we have given up on this current version of the Republican Party, right? That we don't even expect that there's one patriot amongst them serving in the Senate or in the House. That isn't even a part of our calculations. And at what point are we going to have that conversation? I am thoroughly annoyed with Manchin and Sinema and the betrayal, particularly given the crocodile tears that many of them cried in eulogizing my former congressman and now our ancestor, John Lewis, the namesake of the bill. Like, you literally a year ago talked about this lion of a man and the sacrifices and the debt that America owes him, that he took a brick to the face on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, for the right to vote. That is something that he fought for until his dying days. And then you invoke his name on the floor of that body and then won't lift a finger to finish his life's work, right? And so it pisses people off. It pisses off ordinary Americans who aren't obsessed with collegiality and acknowledging my colleague from the state who I don't agree with at all and who's actually lying on the floor today and disrespecting this body. And so again, when you think about what it means to love this country, what it means to love your family and fight for it, I think people are making the calculation that this is worth fighting for. You get up, you see moms pick up cars off of babies and do all kinds of Herculean feats that make it onto the 6 o'clock news. And I think that, again, there are a lot of things that Americans are willing to fight for, and they see the right to vote and this fight for democracy as an important part of it.
Coming up on the end of the scheduled time for this, but I want to just go through one last question really quickly with all the panelists, based off of one that was submitted by an anonymous attendee in the Q&A function, which is, I thought, pretty clever. Just the title of the event, Can We Protect the Vote? And I'd like to also fuse that with a question of what can ordinary people who are not necessarily members of Congress, people who are not necessarily federal judges, what can they do in the foreseeable future to help protect the vote? And Michael, I'll start with you.
Yes, we can protect the vote. It's not going to be in the hands of judges. It never has really been. It's in the hands of people. Make sure that when people come to ask you for your support in an election, ask them what they're going to do to protect our democracy. Stand up for election workers, become poll workers, participate yourselves in our process. We need to build a movement for democracy that can both protect the vote this year, but change the country.
Allison, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I agree. We certainly can. It won't be easy. I believe it takes a multidisciplinary toolbox. It'll take impact litigation. It'll take organizing. It'll take research. It'll take a lot of comms, narrative shifting, paradigm shifting, all of those skills and talents that we have. And if you want to get involved, I believe that change, lasting change, comes from the ground up. It's not who's elected and sent to DC. It's not who's elected and sent to Atlanta. Associate yourself with groups like the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, the New Georgia Project, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters. Consolidate your voice with other voices so that we amplify each other. And that, I think that the allyship I saw around the voting bills this year, I thought was particularly unique. last year, was particularly unique and powerful, and that if we do it that way, we can protect access to the ballot.
Tiffany?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The way that that we are going to protect the ballot is that we all stay in and keep fighting. And it's going to mean having those conversations with your friends, your family, your coworkers. It's making sure that when you go to vote, you're also asking 5 other people to go to vote. And it is demanding and holding accountable the people who are elected to make sure that they are upholding democracy and that they are doing everything that they can to protect the ballot and to protect our democracy. And so it means when we hear election conspiracies or big lie, that we call it out for what it is, that it is a lie, because we don't have 2 parties that are just both sidesing it. We have one party actively undermining democracy and one party trying to actively uphold democracy. And we have to call that out for the truth that it is. And so I could not agree more with Allison. Get involved. Every single group represented here is amazing, and we would love your involvement, but just get involved and stay involved, even on the days where it feels really tough, and then bring along 5 of your friends to join you, because that's what it's going to take.
And Insay.
We can and we must. We're doing it right now. I'm Atlanta public school graduate. We were raised on a steady diet of king quotes. One is the arc of the moral universe is long, but that it bends towards justice. It is long. Michael reminded us about the several attempts to get voting rights passed from the 50s until 1965. And so thinking about, they say it's darkest before dawn. So it is probably 3:45 in the morning as it relates to American democracy, but hold on, because morning is coming. And I think that it's really important for us to have that perspective and to be reminded of that. And we're doing it right now.
Well, I want to close out, first of all, by thanking all of our panelists, Tiffany Muller, Allison Riggs, Nsé Ufot, and Michael Waldman. These are people I've been able to follow and their work I've admired for a while, and it's so great. One of the cool things about this job is that you get the opportunity to sit down and chat with them about some of the most important issues of the day. So I'd like to thank our panelists for taking their time to join us tonight. And I'd also like to thank you, the viewer, for taking your time to join us tonight. If you're interested, we have an event coming up on June 6th about another very important issue facing this country, titled On the Front Lines, Protecting Abortion Rights. My excellent colleague, Melissa Garrett-Grant, is going to be leading that panel. It's a panel of some excellent figures in the world of reproductive justice and women's rights. And they're going to be discussing the National Assault on Women's Rights, the expected outcome of the case Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, and how the response should be to it. So that's going to be on Monday, January 6th at 7 p.m. And you can find out all the details at TNR.com. But again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and looking forward to seeing you then.